Vijay, let's go back to this question of imperialism. Do you think Russia's efforts to redraw the borders of Ukraine, are those efforts comparable to what happened in the 19th century when European powers tried to dismember Africa?
Well, firstly, I'm really happy to be here, and it's nice to see so many people here. I'm actually ecstatic that Foreign Policy magazine has decided to talk about the word imperialism. It's great, and I hope there'll be more such forums on imperialism in the future. I would like to see a cover story at FP on US imperialism and the attempt to suffocate countries by the use of unilateral illegal sanctions, for instance, like Cuba and Venezuela. I'd like to see more discussion about the blockade on Cuba. So I welcome a discussion and debate about the concept imperialism. But I very much don't accept that what happened in February 2022 is imperialism. I think it's an act of war. Lots of countries go to war. When India, for instance, went to war against Pakistan in 1971 to end the genocide taking place in what becomes Bangladesh, was that an act of imperialism or was that an act of war to stop a genocide? Or for instance, when Vietnam crossed the border into Cambodia to end the killing fields against the Cambodian people, that was an act of aggression, of imperialism, or was that an act to end the genocide taking place in Cambodia? You see, if you start the story, and I think this is where a lot of countries in the global south develop their understanding of what's happening in Ukraine. If you start the story with the day the Russian forces enter Ukraine, then it's inevitable that one would talk about it as an act of aggression. But if you look back, even as far back as September 2021, in fact, even earlier, but let's start at September 2021. I mean, the Russians kept coming to the United States, including to NATO, and saying we would like security guarantees. We worry. The United States unilaterally withdrew from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. Donald Trump withdrew in 2019. This created anxiety in Russia. The Russians asked repeatedly, in fact, put a treaty on the table in December of 2021. The Biden administration rejected everything. It was a rejectionist approach to the Russian moves for debate and discussion about their anxiety about security guarantees. I mean, just to put this point very clearly, the United States and its NATO allies are responsible for 74.3% of global military spending. The Russians are responsible for 4%. They have, I think, good reason to be anxious about mid-range nuclear missiles placed either in Germany, in the Baltic states, or in Ukraine. And they tried to put that forward. The question to ask, and it would be an interesting discussion, is why did the Biden administration reject having a conference with the Ukrainians and the Russians, which was on the table? They rejected it right up to January 2022, and then the Russian forces entered Ukraine. Now, I'm not saying Russia should have entered Ukraine, but I think that this question cannot be seen in a static light. You know, is the day the tanks rolled over the border an act of imperialism? One has to see these things historically. Ukraine has to live next to Russia. You can't take Ukraine out and put it into Iowa. You know, it's not going to be able to be moved from its neighborhood. They have to have an understanding with the Russians. The Baltic states have to have an understanding with the Russians. Georgia has to have an understanding with the Russians. They are neighbors. There has to be security guarantees. Why the Biden administration was rejectionist is, to me, the key question. Not why did Russia enter as the only question on February 2022.
Martin, I'd like to go back.
What I was trying to say is that for the rest of us who do not have nuclear weapons, who do not have large, powerful armies, who must resolve the problems that we have in different ways, there are many countries around the world that have problems with the neighboring states, right? Including in Africa. But not every country that has a problem is able to roll tanks across a border. And we have to be consistent in calling out actions that undermine the aspirations to live in a world where bullies don't roll across borders. Today, if Russia's reasoning stands and other countries pursue similar actions, the world will be full of war. So I think, yes, Russia may have had and did have some genuine security concerns. Certainly, the expansion of NATO has been something deeply uncomfortable and perhaps intimidating to Russia. But of course, the countries that NATO has expanded to also say that they are intimidated by Russia, which is why they're in NATO. Look, we cannot have a world of two sets of rules, one for the powerful and one for the rest of us. And that is what I was trying to really defend. I was not there to defend superpower games. I was there to speak for all the countries that have been ravaged by imperial powers and to say we reject that notion of international politics.
It's interesting what you say, because just to make 2 points about that. I mean, let's go back to the African continent. I'm a close observer of the US administration. Obviously, I don't carry water for them either. It's the last thing I would be accused of doing. But it's really interesting. In this year, there was an election in Rwanda. The Rwandan president won by 95% of the vote.
Or 99, according to him.
Let's not get too precise about this, because we might upset some people. The United States was perfectly happy with that. I mean, for all the agita over the elections in Venezuela, it's very interesting that nobody seemed to care that in Rwanda, Paul Kagame wins basically with 100% of the vote. But when Mr. Kagame sends his troops into Mozambique, or when he sends his troops, whether through M23 or, as the Congolese government argues, actual Rwandan forces crossing the border into the Democratic Republic of Congo, that's backed by the US government. I mean, I quite agree with you. I'm not one who says double standards should rule. I would like to see more multilateralism. In fact, I 100% want to go on the record rejecting the Argentinian President Javier Milei's speech at the UN, where he accused the UN of pushing a socialist agenda. I wish the UN was pushing a socialist agenda. It's not doing that. So I want to be on record saying I reject it. We are at a precious time in world history where multilateralism must be defended. The United Nations must be defended. The Charter has to be defended. Part of that, and coming to the question of the big arms, nuclear weapons, missiles, and so on, it is an absolute disgrace that the United States has been unilaterally whittling the arms control regime from the day when George W. Bush in 2002 unilaterally walked out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty. Since the US left the ABM treaty in 2002, there have been a number of rejections of different multilateral, very, very hard-fought, negotiated arms control treaties around nuclear weapons. And that's the cause of this anxiety. It's not the Democratic Republic of Congo that is anxious about being hit with nuclear weapons, because they are, as it is, ravaged by a war nobody seems to care about. Perhaps 6 million people killed in the DRC so that we can have our electronics and so on. It's a disgrace, the way we are silent about what's happening there. But it's not those countries that worry about mid-range nuclear missiles. It's currently China and Russia, which have put on the record that they would like to see a return to a robust arms control system where there's a process. Look, nobody's saying that these wars end easily. Mr. Netanyahu is in New York City today. I think it's very clear that Mr. Netanyahu might go into war against Lebanon, full-scale attack on Lebanon, which would be immensely destabilizing for the whole Middle East. Nobody is in favor of war. What we want is more robust negotiation. And for that, for countries with nuclear weapons and mid-range missiles, you need an arms control regime, which is what was hard fought between the United States and the Soviet Union. Breaking that down after the fall of the Soviet Union was an act of absolute arrogance, and we are paying the price for that.
I want to go back to a point that you made earlier, though, and get Martin's view on this, because it sounds when you say, Vijay, that Georgia needs accommodations with Russia, Ukraine needs to make accommodations with Russia. All of the smaller neighbors surrounding a superpower need to make accommodations. It sounds a bit like you're saying Ukraine is simply a proxy for the West in this conflict. Martin, what do you make of the suggestion that Ukraine's a sort of Trojan horse for NATO?
Well, look, first of all, Vijay, I think you sort of agreed with me when you said you want more multilateralism, you don't want countries to invade one another. So why not just say that and say that about the Russian invasion?
But it's an interesting issue. I'm not in favor of the Russian invasion into Ukraine. I wish it could have been prevented. But the question is, what provoked the invasion? You see, I didn't invade Ukraine. You didn't invade Ukraine. You and I making a public statement saying this was good or bad doesn't change the course of world history. What could have changed the course of world history was a return to the table to create a process for security guarantees. And by no means would I ever say that small states that are next to big states should accommodate by concessions. I think they have to sit down and have a serious talk. Take the case of Nepal and India. India treats Nepal very poorly. If there's any problem with the two countries, India just shuts the border, starves Nepal of trade. It's a landlocked country. I think that kind of behavior is outrageous. These countries need to properly negotiate a way for them to deal with each other. Because at the end of the day, they have to deal with each other. Let's not forget that Volodymyr Zelensky was elected on a mandate of peace, on a mandate of negotiation with Russia. Let's also not forget that after the Russian tanks rolled into the Donbas region of Ukraine, the Ukrainians and the Russians sat in Belarus. They started a negotiation process. They then went to Ankara, Turkey. They continued the process. Boris Johnson shows up in Kiev, goes for that funny walk in the middle of what was, told as, the guy is a comical character anyway. Your prime minister, Sasha, because you lived there at that time, walks around Kiev with Mr. Zelensky and says, we will not, allow any negotiation. And then Lloyd Austin travels to Kiev and makes a public statement, which was, I think, extremely, unfortunate for a high official of a country like the United States to make in the middle of a conflict. He says, we will not back down because we have to weaken Russia. This is not the language that we expect in the service of multilateralism.
But let me stop you there. Are you saying that Ukraine is just a pawn then? Don't they have agency?
No, I'm not saying at all that Ukraine is a pawn. But I am saying that Mr. Zelensky was elected on a mandate of peace. And that's exactly what he tried to pursue. But at some point, Mr. Zelensky was boxed in. If you go and listen to Mr. Zelensky's speech that he gave at the UN this week, he very much said, now you've all abandoned us. Why was Mr. Zelensky now saying, now you've all abandoned us? Why instead was he saying, well, we never really needed you. We are at a war with Russia. We are going to find a way to negotiate with them. Look, if you go and look at the 12 principles that the Chinese laid out for a peace process, those are not the peace plan. It's just principles to start the negotiation.
Let's let Martin respond.
All conflicts end in negotiation. Why not end it now with negotiation?
Martin?
Okay, the way Eurocentric geopolitics works is by perpetually placing in the center of all our attentions the thinking and the actions of powerful Western countries. So Vijay, rather than you are talking more about the United States than about what actually happened, what we need to see emerge is one, multipolarity is coming. The United States will no longer be the unit power globally. There will be other poles of power. The question we have now is, will it be a multipolarity of invasion, oppression, or will it be a lawful and orderly multipolarity? And the idea that Ukraine is a proxy or Ukraine is a mere pawn in the hands of other countries robs Ukraine of agency. And that kind of robbing of agency, we Africans know it. We know it very well. Whatever actions we take are only actions that reflect the interests of greater powers. And so I think, Sasha, the question is not whether the United States is right or Russia, United States versus Russia. It is rather the creation of a separate bloc of countries, the majority of countries, to come together and uphold international law against the whims of the powerful. And that's really the point I'm trying to make. But I think, Vijay, you are so focused on the United States that you miss that we have to hold Russia accountable just as much as we have to hold the United States accountable.
It's interesting that you say that because, I mean, I'm very rarely accused of Eurocentrism. So that's fascinating. But let's take an example of why the United States needs to be taken seriously. Not for itself, but for its behavior. There was a crisis, serious crisis in Libya. I was reporting from that region. I mean, I was reporting from Iraq. I know what a war looks like. It's not something that I would, fly a flag for. It's horrible. It's not just the people dead. It's the noise that affects generations. It's the dust that impacts people. It creates toxic problems for years. I mean, there's a reason why war is terrible. It's terrible. But when the conflict broke out in Libya, the African Union was taking a very active role. You will remember that at the Peace and Security Council in Addis Ababa, there was a decision made to send an African Union delegation to both Tripoli and Benghazi and to negotiate the situation. A plane was prepared. Jacob Zuma, then president of South Africa, was on that plane, part of the delegation. Several heads of government ready to fly to both Tripoli and to Benghazi. And the French government said, you can't go, we're going to start bombing. So the reason why the United States is in fact at the center of these discussions is that it doesn't allow us to create our own basis for security. It's very interesting that the way the African Union Peace and Security Council responded to this was in 2016, they passed a binding resolution, which hasn't been acted upon, which says that there should be no military bases of a foreign kind on the African soil. That was how the African Union responded. Right after that, the United States opened a new base in Accra, Ghana, by taking over one of the airports. So it's not a question of, me imposing the US into the conversation. The United States imposes itself into these conversations and in fact doesn't allow the rest of the world to breathe. I mean, what are US ships doing in the South China Sea? For God's sake, what is this build-up going on? The United States now working with the Australians to advance and to expand the runway in Darwin, Australia, so they can land aircraft there carrying nuclear weapons in violation of the Treaty of Rarotonga, which is a multilateral treaty negotiated by the South Pacific countries, which says this is a nuclear-free zone. And yet the United States is planning to base nuclear weapons in Australia in order to ramp up that, campaign that they have against China. So it's not me bringing the United States into the conversation, Martin. I wish it were, and I wish I could withdraw bringing the US into the conversation. But somewhere in this room, Martin, and I don't know where it is, maybe sitting in here, is US officialdom. And they seem to want to insert themselves either diplomatically or by gunfire. So most often by gunfire.
We've drifted quite far from Russia and Ukraine to the South Pacific now. But let's come back to this.
One word, Sasha,
to Martin,
Vijay is a better historian than I am. But there used to be a left that was able to see a perspective of anti-imperialism going beyond just the West and being able to recognize imperialism anywhere it occurs. But over the years, it has become extraordinarily focused on the United States, extraordinarily focused on the West, due in large part, of course, because of how these countries have been behaving. But I would say that we do need to go back to a left position that is more honest in calling out imperialism when it sees it.
Vijay, do you think the left's failed on that?
No, not at all. I mean, in fact, I think the hand-wringing that takes place is often excessive. I very much agree with you. We need intellectually honest positions. And the most, I think, credible position in all these conflicts is to call for immediate ceasefire and negotiations, less armaments, for instance. I mean, it is obscene that the United States continues to arm Israel as it inflicts a genocide on the Palestinians and now is trying to expand the war, gaslighting us actually, to make us think this is not a genocide, it's an Israeli war against Iran. I mean, Mr. Netanyahu is in an act of gaslighting, really. That's what's happening. But we need negotiations. And I don't see why Western countries are blocking negotiations in Ukraine. There have to be negotiations. As I said, these people have to live next to each other. They're going to have to persist side by side. They need to come up with a modus vivendi. All negotiations don't work in the way that game theorists would like to see. They are tough, difficult processes. As you know, as a diplomat, these are not easy. But there's a lot to be negotiated between Russia, Ukraine, and NATO, inclusive of NATO, because Europe is right now struggling, and the European population is turning against this conflict. Why? It's not logical for European countries to buy liquefied natural gas from the United States, much more expensive, worse for the environment, than to buy piped gas from Russia. Eventually, Europe is going to have to buy piped gas from Russia. They're going to have to live side by side and together. They need to negotiate. That's the intellectually honest position. And let me say one last...
Vijay,
Yeah.
I know negotiation. That negotiation that was happening in Turkey was a negotiation for Ukraine's surrender. It was not a negotiation for Ukraine to be able to stand as a free sovereign state. Now, remember the Budapest Memorandum when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. And Ukraine was promised safety by the Russians, right? This doesn't look like that safety. So if they then now negotiate a peace agreement, how can they guarantee their future independence? Because what has been being put on the table is essentially disarm and be completely available for us to do with as we wish. That is not a negotiation.
But you see,
that is an act of surrender. Now, hold on.
You wanted an argument. This is going to be an argument.
Does that mean that NATO is pursuing the right actions? I don't think it does.
Yeah.
But to tell Ukraine, disarm yourself, bare your throat to me, and this constitutes peace. That's not peace. That's just waiting for the next time the next guy gets pissed off enough about whatever and decides to invade.
It's interesting. Every time it looks like we're going to start disagreeing, you throw something on the table that messes up the disagreement. Because, I mean, the issue is, of course, the Budapest Memorandum, but it's also the handshake agreement between Edward Shevardnadze and James Baker, which said that the Soviets at the time were going to accept the unification of Germany as long as NATO didn't move 1 inch beyond the east of the new German border. And of course, NATO advanced, including talking to Russia about joining NATO. That was what was interesting in the Yeltsin period. I'm actually a person that believes that NATO is a very dangerous force on the planet now. NATO's ambitions, what Ivo Dalader wrote in 2006, Global NATO, this is a real question. We have a UN Charter. The UN Charter is the most important document in the world because it's negotiated and agreed by all countries. It's the only binding charter that all countries agree to. It's a very important sacred document. The UN Charter doesn't permit a force like NATO to operate on its own and to act as if Chapter 6 and 7 of the UN Charter are its property. That means that it gets to enforce without a Security Council mandate sanctions against other countries. It's illegal. If you don't have a UN Security Council resolution on Chapter 6, you can't enforce sanctions against a country. You can do it one country to another, but you can't enforce third-party sanctions. That's what the United States is doing to Cuba, for instance. It's totally illegal policy. And Chapter 7 is interesting because after the vote in UN Resolution 1973, when South Africa, Brazil, other global South big players abstained from Resolution 1973, which gave a Chapter 7 resolution saying any member state can act to intervene in Libya, and NATO intervened. After that, the South Africans, The Brazilians and others said, we will never give a Chapter 7 resolution, again, open-ended like this, because NATO exceeded the mandate. The mandate of Resolution 1973 was a no-fly zone, was to prevent conflict. It wasn't to go in there and destroy the Libyan state. That was far exceeding the mandate. And it's interesting, because I covered that in detail. We asked NATO directly, the legal department, can you give us your understanding of the mandate of 1973 and how you responded, and whether you committed war crimes in Libya? NATO's response, it was a public letter. NATO's response was categorical. Firstly, we will not answer these questions. And secondly, we didn't commit war crimes because NATO never commits war crimes. Other people do. I mean, I think the world needs to really come to some understanding of NATO's self-identification as a global policeman, going out there bullying small countries around the world.
But
I
Vijay,
think this is a serious issue, because Libya today is in a harrowing situation. There is no government. This country, which had human indicators for whatever problems one might have had with the Gaddafi government, human indicators were all extremely good. Now the country is absolutely destroyed. And NATO will not be held accountable for this. Neither Nicolas Sarkozy nor Barack Obama. Nobody has answered for the exceeding of mandate in UN Resolution 1973. If we talk about multilateralism, we should honor the terms of the mandate given to any member state. We can't just allow these things to, well, this just happened and give it up. If we don't go back and do an accounting, then we don't have a policy. Then all you have is history.
Vijay, if this were a debate on Libya, we wouldn't have a debate, because I'd agree with you.
Yes.
Right?
Which is why I want to use the Libyan example.
But let me...
Well, it's interesting. The word pawn and proxy was used by the two of you, not by me. I don't see these countries as either proxies or pawns. That was your word. And pawn was your word. Other people may use it. I don't see it like that. I see it differently. I understand people have security concerns, but I question them. I would caution them. Say that, look, I get that you have security concerns, but is your security best guaranteed by NATO? Is joining NATO the best guarantee of your security, or is that going to create even more problems for you? Is there another thing that could happen? And we need to think creatively about different forms of security. We need to actually have, I mean, I know that the UN constantly has all kinds of special sessions. There was this big special session after the Libya war to construct the concept once more of responsibility to protect. You remember, after the Iraq war, interventionism was given a bad name for good reason. So that the West then, with Kofi Annan, impaneled a commission on responsibility to protect to rehabilitate the term intervention through responsibility to protect. Libyan intervention was done through R2P. Well, if they were so in such a hurry to make an R2P type special session, have a commission and so on, why not impanel a UN commission, have a special session? Let's talk about the security of small countries next to large countries. Let's have a big open debate. Let's talk to China. Let's talk to Russia, India, Brazil. These are all big countries. Rwanda is not a big country, but Rwanda punches
Vijay,
way above its
Russia,
weight in Africa.
Hold on,
country.
Vijay. But do Russia and China really care about the security of small countries nearby?
I think so.
Do they?
Yes, because they have to. Because, for instance, let's take an example. Let's look at the issue of Southeast Asia. China went to war against Vietnam in 1979. That was a ridiculous, stupid war, in my opinion. I think all sides now understand that that war was meaningless, should not have happened. Chinese-Vietnamese relations have improved dramatically. With Cambodia, with Laos, these are very good relations now. They are seriously interested in having a trade relations with small neighbors, including in Central Asia, and not going out there and stamping all over them and building military bases. There are no Chinese military bases in Central Asia, but there's a lot of Chinese rail line, there's a lot of Chinese factories, there's a lot of Chinese trade. This has improved life expectancy in these countries. We have proved in our institute, when you increase net fixed capital, you improve life expectancy. That's exactly what we are seeing. In fact, I hope someday Afghanistan can have a different kind of government and they can invite this kind of Netflix capital, and they can improve the situation in that country. Afghanistan is not going to be improved by another invasion. It will be improved with more trade, with better openness to the world and so on. And that's what at least China is interested in doing. So I actually think if there was a push in the United Nations, in a system which is really quite shaky right now, if there was a serious push, if countries came there and said, we want a special session, we would like a commission on small states and security, I think that could at least put us somewhere towards the conversation. You know, what we want is to advance the agenda. That's what we're looking for.
I think one of your books is about the darker nations, right? And that is really a book about the history of what used to be called the Third World, a bloc that stood on its own and understood itself as distinctly different from the superpowers. And that is, I think, what I aspire to.
For Vijay, I'm wondering what you think about the Chinese genocide of the Uyghur population, since you've been sort of touting them as kind of the good guys in this context, and yet there is a genocide happening within the state.
It was interesting that most people in the world had no idea anything about the Uyghurs or about Xinjiang as a province of China until a German right-wing conservative whose office is right next to the Langley office of the CIA wrote a report about this. It is true that China had a serious problem in the Xinjiang province because similar to the issue of Al-Shabaab in Somalia, the Al-Qaeda groups in Afghanistan were training people from the Uyghur population. I met some of them in Idlib in Syria, where their headquarters is now. It's not in Xinjiang. It's not even in Afghanistan. It's not in Uzbekistan, but it's in Idlib in Syria. And there were acts of terror. But the Chinese government decided to do something interesting in order to confront the acts of terror taking place in Urumqi and other places. Rather than go and bomb these cities, which is what one option, United States did that in Afghanistan, you just go and carpet bomb a city. They didn't do that. The other option is just to take a whole bunch of people and throw them permanently in prison. That's what the United States did in Guantanamo. Instead, they actually used a policy developed by ex-jihadis from Libya, the Killiam Foundation, based in Britain, which is about de-radicalization. They brought in people who they felt were terrorists or whatever, and they had these de-radicalization camps. Now, whether you like what they did or not, to call that a genocide, I think, is a bit much. If you go to Urumqi or you go to Xinjiang now, I don't think you're seeing mosques destroyed. I think a lot of these stories were highly exaggerated. There was a serious problem. They dealt with it how they dealt with it. I don't necessarily agree with how they dealt with it, but I don't think we can use the Convention Against Genocide loosely and rhetorically to characterize things as a genocide. The United States tried to characterize the Libyan government bombing in Benghazi as genocidal. After that war ended, Amnesty International's their main investigators went on the ground and they did a number of reports where they showed there was no act of genocide. The claims of genocide were being made by a Saudi newspaper, which had been really, ginning up the story, exaggerating things and saying it's a genocide. The word genocide is pretty precise. There's a UN Convention Against Genocide, 1951. It was used by the International Court of Justice to say that there's reasonable evidence of genocide in Gaza. There is an actual definition of genocide. I don't think what was happening in Xinjiang raises to the question of genocide, which is how you characterized it. It was certainly a serious problem. They dealt with it in a way, at least they didn't go and carpet bomb the whole place or put people in prison for the rest of their lives. They did something, whether you agree with it or not is different, but it's certainly not genocide.
I want to thank you for your insightful commentary. I do have a question for Mr. Prashad. You did indicate, or seem to indicate, that the invasion of Ukraine or expanded invasion of Ukraine would not have happened if the U.S. had not withdrawn from the arms deal in 2019 and walked away from negotiations in 2021. However, I'm wondering what your evidence is, or what you see as evidence that they wouldn't have done this, considering a lot of people have pointed out that Russia has seen Ukraine as the birthplace of their empire and the origin of their story for hundreds of years, and they invaded Crimea in 2014 before we walked out of the arms treaty in 2019. So what do you see as the evidence for that they would not have invaded, eventually at least, if we had stayed in that arms treaty?
You know, one of the interesting things about the story of the collapse of the USSR was that when it happened in 1991, it was pretty stunning to me that it didn't result in a number of border conflicts immediately. You know, when that happened, there was no real border conflict. The one border conflict predated the collapse of the USSR, and that was over Nagorno-Karabakh between Azerbaijan and Armenia. That predated the collapse. It took about 10 years for the various new states and the new Russian state to start having problems with the borders. Georgia was the first, started around 2000. There was a military conflict in 2008, and then Ukraine. It was pretty inevitable that these states were going to face a challenge in their new formation. Because when the Soviet Union was created, it was created not exactly to have, you know, national states. Even though they were the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, Ukraine, as it was constituted, was not just Ukrainian speakers. It was much enlarged. Largely, the industrial part of Russia was put into Ukraine, into the Ukrainian SSR. It was inevitable that these kind of problems were going to occur. As far as Crimea is concerned, it's not just Crimea. There are two warm water ports that the Russians had been concerned about after the collapse of the USSR. One is in Crimea. That was a very important warm water port for Russia. The other is in Tartus in Syria, because Russia took control of Crimea in 2014 and entered Syria in 2015 September to defend its port in Tartus in Latakia. They have an understanding that these are the only two ports for their warm water fleet. If Russia lost these two ports, they don't have a warm water fleet. That's what the understanding was. So they intervened actually not just in Crimea, but in both countries to take the warm water fleet. I don't think the seizing of Crimea in 2014 was about irredentism, going back to a historical story of the formation of the Russian people and so on. I think that was much more a hard-nosed military decision about their warm water ports, the only two that they had at the time. Now, because of global warming, it's likely that some of the Arctic ports might become warm water ports. It's not something to be happy about, but it is happening.
Okay, Martin, I'd like to give you some final words. Would you like to respond to Vijay's comments about Russian intervention in Syria and in Crimea? Is it just legitimate strategic defense?
I didn't say legitimate. You said legitimate.
It sounded
Very interesting.
It sounded like you were saying.
No, I just described what happened. That doesn't mean it's legitimate.
Okay, what is it then?
It's what happened.
It's strategically defensible?
From their perspective, it was a military decision. It wasn't a decision about several hundred years of emotional attachment to that part of the world. That's what I was answering. I'm very precise in my answers. So,
on that note, we're going to end. That's all we have time for today. Thank you to my guest, Martin Kimani, Kenya's former UN ambassador, executive director of the NYU Center on International Cooperation, and Vijay Prashad, historian, journalist, executive director of Tricontinental. Thanks to both of you. And thanks to all of you in the audience. Thank you for coming out.
Thank you,
Thank you, Sasha.
That was